Let's talk about February GigaTen, and I always print it out because I'm analog.
Looks pretty.
It looks great.
Prettier than original.
Yes, I love, I was just talking to my son about analog, who's in music. He's like, everything sounds better with analog. But anyway, for another day. It was a big beginning to the year. There's a lot to talk about. I'm up all night catching up with news on my news feeds. So it's an extra few hours now every night. But let's talk about number one, Trump 2.0.
Yeah, I think there's no way around it, right? Like that is what has been dominating everything this month. I think carbon removal is not excluded from that. And I've been trying to make sense of this in an article I wrote, in conversations, in a webinar, in a podcast, just trying to kind of get the latest and greatest of what's happening. I think so far the gist is that some things have been quite affected, right? Especially DOE. And actually, as of today, if you go on their website, they removed the carbon removal website completely. And also any job titles with carbon have been changed. So those are just some immediate changes we've noticed today. But then beyond that, obviously a freezing of all the funds that had already been promised to companies. And actually I was curious because on one of my posts, I mentioned how companies like Heirloom and Climeworks and so on might get into trouble because they are banking on 600 million from DOE. You said you would potentially find out more. So I was curious to hear if you have found out more.
Yeah, you got me. I haven't found out more, but I will. Now that you mentioned it, I'm on the hook for that answer. What I found interesting is exactly what you say in your bit of a summary. Is it actually what's going to happen, or is it just a different rhetoric? And what I found interesting is I realized, based on also my promise to figure this out, was I listened to the Doge midnight presser that Elon did. And one of the things that his approach was to shut it down first, to then the default is shut down and then build back up what we want, rather than find the other way around, because it's so complex and they want to be consequent immediately. Now, I'm not arguing whether this is the right thing to do or not, but just that's the approach. So if things have been changed, doesn't mean that that's how it's going to be forever. It's just that they came in with this mandate to, make government efficient. And so it's, shut it down, build it back. So I can't imagine that CDR is going to be removed from the future programming of our country. That would blow my mind, especially because Elon himself did the $100 million CDR Prize. So he does know that figuring out how to cycle carbon is essential. So I don't know.
Yeah, no, I had the same thought. And for me, this was more of a pause than essentially an abolishment of these funds, right? What does worry me is the approach to the word carbon. It feels like carbon could become politicized as a word. And that could lead to challenges. Again, I agree. And that was my point, right? Change in narrative, not in substance. I think carbon removal will continue in the next 4 years in the US. The thing that worries me a bit is the politicization of the word carbon.
Well, that already is in place. That's already happened. I mean, a lot of people in America anyway say, why is carbon such a hated thing? It's the basis for all life, which, I mean, in truth, carbon has been demonized. I can even say I created a carbon monster once. But obviously it was in relation to the, misunderstanding of how we're imbalancing the carbon cycle itself. Right. But to be fair, it has been abused on one way and the other. So yeah, I think it would be problematic and difficult to have to find another word, but maybe shout out to the whole industry, start thinking about other names for what you do. And I guess it's not funny, but
one additional variable that I'm quite interested in that's early days is tariffs, and basically understanding what role tariffs will have on the sales of carbon removal credits, right? From what I understand so far, these tariffs tend to be targeted on very specific categories, and those are kind of the big categories. And so I've spoken to some folks, for example, in Canada who know their stuff, and they told me, yeah, at least for Canada, that's not what the tariffs are about. But that's just one thing that I'm watching on the sidelines, is how potentially tariffs could impact the industry, given that 80% of purchases last year from in CDR came from American companies, right? Importing CDR. So we should definitely watch the whole tariff discussion also very closely.
That's fascinating, and I have no idea how that's going to pan out. Another tidbit was, there's two thoughts on the tariff thing, which was, especially with Canada, a Trump official this morning on Bloomberg radio was saying it was about the drug war and fentanyl. Now, whether or not it was about that more than products. And then I saw a t-shirt circulating on, I think it was X, that said, "I survived the 2025 trade war, February 3rd, 2025 to February 3rd, 2025.
Let's hope it stays like that.
Right? I mean, maybe hope springs eternal, but that's kind of, yeah. And again, with tariffs, like you said, I mean, again, a lot of this is unknown how it'll actually play out. So maybe in some cases it's helpful. I know that global trade deals were something that we were all taught was ideal, but I do know, and even when I was a student studying economics, was, sometimes these big deals aren't optimal for certain countries because they fall under very general rules. So who knows? Maybe unilateral trade deals might be all right, but I know that's very controversial. We'll see. All right. So in light of all of this, Switzerland, number 2, I'm banking on Switzerland. Yeah, there's other countries that can take leadership in this space. So it looks like Switzerland is doing that.
So it was quite interesting. I did a poll on LinkedIn to actually ask kind of where are we going to see CDR action. And I do polls regularly. I've never had a poll that was so clear. It was like 80% of people said Europe. Out of 4 options. And so, yeah, we see a lot of countries in Europe taking the lead, right? And Switzerland is one of them. And what is unique about Switzerland is they've already determined exactly how much CDR they will need in 2050 to reach net zero, which is 7 megatons. They've already determined how much they need from abroad, which is 5 megatons. And they're already getting going on making bilateral treaties with countries in the global south, especially, to import that CDR. They've got more Article 6 deals, I think it's 12 now, than any other country in the world. And they've allocated a bunch of money, 1.2 billion Swiss francs, to kind of financing the domestic transition. And they've just released a grant for like 100 million for CDR, but also some CCUS. So that's all really good stuff. And what I also like about the Swiss approach is it's different from other countries. They're banking completely on private companies, corporations taking the lead, not the government. For example, I won't expect public procurement in Switzerland, but they've now released guidance for companies on setting interim carbon removal targets, which is really unique and visionary. It's voluntary, but if you want to get any funding from kind of the green transition pots, you have to adhere to these. So it's kind of semi-voluntary. So there's a lot of good stuff. What I would say is 2 things that I still have criticisms of Switzerland's approach. One, it's always ducks and becks. I mean, this is a recurring theme. I think we're going to touch on this again in this discussion, but they haven't looked beyond ducks and becks seriously, which is, I think, a shame, because they also have a lot of agriculture in Switzerland. They have other things they can do. And the second thing is that they define permanence as 30 years or more. And again, this is something that's coming to light a lot now, that we need to standardize these definitions of permanence, and 30 years is definitely not in line with science, which should be 1,000, right? So they're doing great, but they still have some small areas for improvement that I hope they're going to tackle.
And the link in your GigaTen has a link to those incentives for companies or guidelines?
Yes, it's all linked there.
Okay, great. All right, cool. And 3 for Africa Rising, we called it in Legion 44 the gift of the rift. Kenya specifically has all the right elements, but not just Kenya. Africa in general is going to be a huge player. So what have you discovered about Africa Rising?
I mean, there's a couple of things there. First, it wasn't my newsletter because it happened today, actually. We're recording on February 7th. The Carbon Removal Kenya Association launched, which I was very glad about. It's the 2nd association in the Global South after India for carbon removal. I did my little part in the early days, and then I phased out, and they've essentially set up a whole functioning trade association that is unifying the sector, which is fantastic because there's already momentum, and that will essentially help drive the momentum forward. then remove a famous accelerator in CDR. They've already funded and supported over 100 startups. They opened their Africa accelerator now, the Africa Carbon Removal Accelerator, again, to really build an ecosystem of domestic carbon removal companies. And then there's also a call for proposals by Tencent, a Chinese tech company, specifically for tech CDR made in Kenya. So there's just a lot of things that are happening right now around Africa and especially Kenya when it comes to carbon removal, which is great to see.
Yeah, and for those of anyone who wants to learn about CDR, we're doing a Legion 44 premiere April 26th with Octavia and Sela and maybe Flux also. So
where's this, in Nairobi?
Kenjin. Yeah, Nairobi, nice, April 26th. So Legion is on the rise. I don't want to distract from the Africa point, but it's absolutely something that I loved seeing, and why we opened in Africa, because everyone is always looking to the global north for climate discussions, and really the global south has a massive role to play. And I think we've touched on that before, but and that leads us to number 4. Octavia shows us how it's done in terms of community building as well, and consequence.
So Octavia, for those who don't know it, was, I think, the first African, if not maybe still the only, but definitely the first DAC company. They're from Kenya. And they just released their community engagement, essentially, strategy, which is, it's really amazing for me. I worked in the Global South a lot in international development, and all these guidances always came from the North, right? They're always pushed onto projects in the Global South. It wasn't really ethical in my perspective. And so it's great to see them taking the lead. It's also a smart business move, because they're essentially raising the bar for anyone who wants to do direct air capture in Kenya, and raising it potentially to a level that maybe some competitors will not be able to keep. Because they're really focusing on key things like local leadership. They say that they've got 98% Kenyans employed, right? Local value creation, doing all the manufacturing made in Kenya. That's all stuff that is essential alongside informed consent, zero corruption, all of that. And it's essentially setting the bar. And what I really like about their approach as well, which is really smart, one thing that DAC struggles with a little bit is the co-benefits discussion. Because on the one hand, DAC is 100% additional. If it wasn't for the DAC facility, there wouldn't be a carbon removal there, right? Whereas you could do biochar just as a soil enhancement, for example. On the other hand, DAC really just creates the carbon removal and employment because of that, right? But it doesn't have all these other benefits than some of the other carbon removal solutions have. And so what I liked about this report, this strategy, is they really show how DAC can be much more than just carbon removal. It can be much more than just job creation. It can actually have all these other benefits on local communities and economies and health and everything else. And so I thought it was just a nice vision that other DAC companies could maybe adopt. And again, kudos to them for getting it out first.
Yeah, and that was another major point we leaned in on, was the intentionality around these companies in the global south, especially in Kenya, and how they had thought through a lot of these things, and how this industry can make everything right again, not just necessarily with balancing out the carbon cycle, but also, creating native industries that bring prosperity. So
yes.
It's terrific. Charts, 4 times charts in number 5. Sorry. Can't help it.
That time of the year. CDR.FYI, the main data platform of the sector, released their year in review. And there's a lot of good stuff in there. So I don't know how much we can cover in this session, but maybe high level. I was quite positively surprised by the growth of the sector. Because frankly, from my vantage point, 2024 seemed like quite a rough year. But what we see is actually that sales have gone up 78% to 8 megatons. And actually that 8 megatons is more than has been sold in all the previous years combined. So that was very positive. And also very positive is that deliveries have gone up 120% to 310 kilotons. And that's essential, again, more than in all previous years combined. Essentials because we need deliveries to pick up pace. In the previous year, remember that we saw mainly sales go up and not deliveries. And now we're also seeing deliveries go up considerably. So that is great. That's pointing in the right direction, right? We also see one thing that I found interesting, the average price went from $490 to $320, which again is great. Like that's a huge jump, actually, a 35% reduction in price on average. Again, I think that's positive. There's a huge spectrum. They showed how for DAC it can go from $100 to $2,000. That's still a problem, I think, but it's good to see the general direction of travel, that it's volumes going up, deliveries are going up, and the prices are going down.
Well, I mean, and that's what happens as new industries emerge. Hopefully efficiencies are going to go up and sales improve and everything gets better. So why not? So number 6, nothing lasts forever except biochar. I mean, that was great news, actually. And rare news, because you need long-term studies. And
this is an interesting one, because what we've seen, especially last year, were a lot of studies highlighting the permanence. And again, I've linked it in the newsletter to just a summary of all the different studies. What they did this time actually was take aim at the main, I would say, scientific approach to permanence that has been done for the last decade, and showing why that is actually inaccurate. So not just, hey, here's the science that has happened in the last year, but here's why we've gotten it wrong before. And I mean, without nerding out too much, but basically these kind of two-pool decay models that they're talking about, and the most famous study is by Wolf, and that's actually in the IPCC. You can find that. You can find it in the Puro methodology. You can find it in the CSI methodology. So this is really has had a huge impact on how we think about permanence for biochar. And they essentially showed, and again, we can go into the details if you want, but they essentially show why it's just an approach that doesn't make sense scientifically. And so I think it's a really important study that will hopefully shake up especially these standards and the IPCC. We already see more modern standards like isometric, reverse, even the EU adopt the new science alongside the old one. Hopefully, over time, we can just phase out the old one and focus on the new one.
And what is inertite?
Inertinite.
Inertinite.
So biochar is composed of, to really put it simply, of 3 different factions, chemical categories. One is labile factions, which essentially get eaten by soil bacteria quite quickly. The second one is semi-inertinite, and the third is inertinite. And inertinite is essentially a physical chemical structure that can be found quite deep in the Earth's crust. So it's a very stable form of carbon. And what you can do nowadays is you can measure the exact percentage of these 3 factions. And you should only credit for permanent removals the inertinite faction, because we know that that is geologically stable. And that's what we can do now. We can say it's 95%, it's 98%, it's 99.9% inertinite. And that's the carbon removal part. Whereas what we've done until now is just assumptions of 75, 80% for 100 years. We really had no idea. But now we do, and we have the testing to do it.
Moving on to Puro Gold, number 7.
Yeah, I mean, I mainly want to talk about 𝗿𝗄𝗋𝗿. So again, every month I highlight one of the women that I look up to in the space. And this time it's 𝗿𝗄𝗋𝗿, who is a policy veteran, and one of the few people that I make sure to talk to on a very regular basis, because she always has loads of insights when it comes to IPCC, UNFCCC, European policy. And she is the VP of policy at Puro. And they also, by the way, she's the woman behind the Puro policy meta map, which I linked in the newsletter, which is a fantastic policy resource that shows all the policies on a timescale until 2030. But yeah, just highlighting her, give her a follow. And if you ever have the pleasure of speaking to her, definitely poke her brains on all things policy.
And number 8, also your CDR scoop is going well.
Yes, this is going very well. We launched this, me and 𝗿𝗿𝗃𝗿 launched the CDR Policy Scoop as a LinkedIn Live, and we're still doing that almost once a week. But we've decided to also turn it into a podcast, because many people came to us and essentially told us, we would love to listen to this, but we want to do it on our own terms when we go for a jog. Great, we did that. And we're now on 8 episodes, and yeah, getting very positive feedback. It's really unfiltered, punchy conversations between me, 𝗿𝗿, sometimes guests. Our last episode was with Robert Höglund on the like-for-like principle. And yeah, I really enjoy those. And I think other people do too, because the format is very different from what people are usually used to. And it's quite tough for the people who join our scoop as well, because we essentially tell them it's a dinner table conversation. but we will air it live and we'll also put it on Apple Podcasts. So yeah, but it's fun. Listen into it.
Especially with regulations, things are changing so much policy-wise. So it's so important. So all the time. Anyway, number 9, how will Europe fund CDR scale up?
Fortunately, we don't know, and that's the problem. They hosted a workshop, the European Commission, which was incredibly well attended. There were like 350 people online and 150 people in person, which, for an EU CDR funding workshop a couple of years ago, you wouldn't have gotten 20 people in the room. So I thought that was great. And everyone was waiting for, the money tree to be shaken and the great reveal. That didn't happen. I didn't expect that, but that didn't happen. And also, frankly, there was a presentation at the beginning that I thought was really off. I raised it on LinkedIn, and I think it resonated with a lot of people. Again, it was heavy 𝗥𝗲𝗿𝗍𝗄𝗏 bias. Biochar enhanced weathering was just awfully represented. So there were some real issues with the presentation. But then also all the different funding officials of the European Union, there were like different presentations from different people. And when they presented, it was so obvious that they didn't understand CDR. They just didn't. They somehow understood CCS, and they were like, yeah, we have funding for CCS, and if you do 𝗥𝗲𝗿𝗄𝗏 and 𝗥𝗲𝗃, maybe you can apply. And it was just really confusing and disappointing overall. And I think it was a lost opportunity, because what we should have done in that workshop is educate those people on CDR. I wish there'd been like a 1-hour presentation for those people, because they're never going to be in the same room again, about this is CDR, these are the different technologies, this is why you should fund it. Instead, they were talking to us in a way that showed their kind of lack of understanding. And yeah, it was a frustrating workshop, I found. There's going to be another one in May, which hopefully will be a bit more productive. And shout out also, 𝗥𝗲𝗺𝗵 is hosting an event on February 18th, where they will reveal kind of a resource with all the different EU funding opportunities, simplified, hopefully, for startups to actually do something about it. But again, I see systemic issues. So even if you know what funding is out there, it will likely not apply to your startup. And that needs to change.
I don't know if this will help, but we are going to be screening at the European Parliament. And I know that Center for Negative Emissions is setting up a couple of screenings, or at least one. And then we have another screening in Bonn with another entity. So I know Europe has all sorts of different sections of the governance. So I'll let you know.
You need to make sure the right people are in the room. We need to make sure these funding officials attend that screening.
Well, you should. We'll talk later. I'll let you know when these things are, and yeah, to make it worth it. All right. So moving on to number 10, is Brazil CDR's best kept secret? Probably, right? Given biomass there.
Like, for me, it's really, I put some of these stats in there, right? Like, it's wild. Like, one single country with 28% of the world's biomass. For me, that stat alone blows my mind. Then they have a ton, 90% plus renewable electricity. They've got a single geological reservoir, a single one that can store 250 megatons per year. They were the first country in the world to actually institute regulation for what is basically enhanced weathering. And so I could keep going on and on, right? Biochar was invented in the Amazon, right? Like, there's COP there this year. There's so many reasons why we should focus on Brazil. And yet we're not, right? There are only a handful of startups there. And that's kind of the question I posted on LinkedIn. A lot of people reacted, was like, look, why? Like, what's happening here? It doesn't make sense to me. It doesn't add up. And my hope is that the troops are going to rally together. And so if anyone hears this and is working on Brazil, or on CDI in Brazil, please do get in touch. I think it's time to get everyone together, because, yeah, Brazil could be the main exporter of CDR globally, easily, with the potential it has. But right now, it's not even scratching the surface.
Well, there's a lot of opportunity there. And I think that, the Amazon in general brings me to my ad. I think I'm going to add an 11th one every month. But you guys are just there in the Amazon in Bolivia, actually, for the very same reason that 𝗥𝗲𝗺𝗏 is actually one of the largest delivery companies that deliver removals through biochar, right? What was that like?
It was incredible. On a personal level, it was a life dream of mine to see the Amazon, and it kind of really drives home what we're trying to preserve, right? So it was a very impactful trip for personal reasons. But then also, for those who don't know, like 𝗥𝗲𝗺𝗿𝗃, one company, the biggest CDR company in the world. Which sector exists in the world where the biggest company comes not just from the global south, but from a country like Bolivia, right? This is amazing. That on its own. And they delivered 26% of all durable carbon removal last year, one company. And just to put it into perspective as well, they have 2 facilities right now. They're building a third, and they're doubling the size of each. But just one of those facilities at current size does more biochar carbon removal than all of Germany combined. And Germany is like the European biochar powerhouse. This is one facility that you can walk through in 5 minutes. It's crazy what they have set up. And so this is definitely something that with Matthew, with the 𝗥𝗲𝗺 team, we want to tell that story. We want to show it because we think that if we can show the incredible story of biochar carbon removal in Bolivia with 𝗥𝗲𝗺, we can get more people excited about it. So yeah, very keen for this and glad to see what comes out.
Yeah, that was amazing. I've looked at the footage, looks amazing. And yeah, Bolivia is leading Brazil, actually, I guess. But
Right
Brazil
now,
can
yes.
catch up.
Definitely should catch up.
Yes. Well, that was great. I really look forward to seeing how all this develops on the ground in the United States. I just think it's too big of an opportunity to miss. And I hope and pray that it goes forward.
We'll have a lot more conversations about that, I'm sure.
Yeah, exactly. All right. All right, Sebastian.
Thanks, Leila.